So St. Joseph has been good to me, and it's fun to be back here again and fun to be here with you all. I have been working with the Ioways in one form or another probably for about 25 years. I'm from the state of Iowa originally, and I was probably 30 before I realized where the name Iowa came from. We were told when I was a kid it was beautiful land, which of course is not true. I think that was the tourism, Department of Tourism. Foster, really curious about them. And then after doing that for a while, I started realizing, well, they're still here, so I need to contact them. You know, it would be fun to hear what they have to say. So I guess in probably about 2000, 2001, I worked up the nerve. I'm an introvert, so that was really hard for me to work up the nerve to call the tribal office. But we began at that point a relationship. So it's been really good, and it's been fun to watch what the Ioways are doing now and how they've progressed in the last 25 years. And Michael Kelly, I just saw him walk in the door. He'll be talking after me, and some of you may have seen him yesterday. He's the director at the Mission Museum over near Highland, which you'll hear more about later. So what I'm going to do, Michael and I are going to, hopefully I won't kind of steal any of his story, but what we're going to do is I'm going to talk kind of about the Ioway, where they came from, just sort of give you some background on the Ioways. Unfortunately, the Saxon Foxes are going to get short-shifted here because I don't really know much about them, certainly not as much as I should. But we will mention them a little bit because they do share, or they have reservations that are side by side in Kansas and Nebraska, and they've been together up there since 1837. So even though they're very distinct cultures, they have also have 150 some years, 160 years or more of living side by side and intermarrying, and it's an interesting situation. And then I'll talk a little bit about the trail, how it went through the reservation, and some of the effects that it had on the Ioways, how they dealt with it, but then how that, in a sense, it kind of took a toll on some of the tribe. So let's see how this works. Not only am I wearing my Osage tie, but I'm borrowing an Osage map because it seems to best kind of illustrate what I'm working on. The Ioway story starts up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The Ioway's own history, their oral history, that's where they speak of their birthplace, in a place called Báxoje, which is Red Earth, right up in Green Bay there in Wisconsin. And it's only recently sort of come to my attention that there was, that history really probably started in about the year 1300 or so. And that, of course, indigenous people have lived here for thousands of years. We can safely say 12,000 years they've lived on this continent, although a lot of Native people will tell you they've always been here. And I think archaeologists are slowly kind of warming up to the fact that their presence on this continent could have preceded the last ice age. So I'm going to step away here real quick so that I can point. But so the Ioways and the Osages sort of start their story way up there in the south of the Great Lakes. And you can see that I've divided here the Chowere Siouan and the Dagia Siouan. So these nations were basically related, but they spoke different variations of the same language. And so the Ioways, the Winnebagos, Otos, and Missouris all speak the same version of the Siouan language. And the Osages, Poncas, Omahas, and Quapaws speak a different version of the Siouan language. And when we say Siouan language, it's like English is a Latin-based language, but so is French, Italian, and so that's the same kind of thing. So at some point they would have been related thousands and thousands of years ago. So their story kind of starts up in the eastern Great Lakes, and then they probably, let me look at the time, but they wandered, sort of kind of migrated down the Ohio River. And that migration probably began about 2,000 years ago to 1,500 years ago. They can trace this, interestingly, by not only archaeological evidence, but language evidence, and how language changed and how language has developed, which is really fascinating. And then probably at about the year, or about 1,500 years ago, they came down here to the Mississippi River. And at that point, the Degians and the Jiwete split up. And not only did those two groups split up, but the smaller groups, they started at that time about 1,500 years ago to become the distinct tribal entities that we know today. The Ioways, the Degians kind of spread this way, but the Ioways went north. And so you see the Ho-Chunks, Winnebagos ended up in Wisconsin. Well, the whole group ended up in Wisconsin, all the Jiwetes, but the Ho-Chunks stayed in Wisconsin, and then they started to migrate back. The Ioways, you can see, stayed up there in southern Minnesota, and the Missouris, kind of, and Oto's closer to where we are now, right here. Now, mind you, this happened over thousands and thousands of years. So it's really at Mayashuje then, even though there was all this migration history previously, the Ioway's own story only starts, the oral tradition really starts at Mayashuje. So at that time, this is just kind of an interesting aside because there was, have any of you heard of Cahokia, the ancient city of Cahokia? So that was a Mississippian city, and Cahokia would be right here, which is about the site of St. Louis, Missouri. It's just across the river on the Illinois side. And that was considered a Mississippian culture, and at the same time, there was something called the Oneota culture, and that's up here. And the Oneota culture is northern Missouri, pretty much all of Iowa, southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern Illinois. And the Ioways, several of these Siouan tribes, including the Ioways, were part of that Oneota culture. But interestingly, the Osages claim they were part of this Mississippian culture. And the cultures are really interesting. They lived side by side. They learned from each other. The Mississippian culture that produced this really complicated, technically advanced city of Cahokia was definitely a top-down culture. It was a hierarchical culture. There were a small group of people who ruled everything and a large number of people who did the work. The Oneotas, on the other hand, were more egalitarian. Their tribal units were smaller. Their villages were smaller. I know with the Ioways, there would be the Bear Clan and the Buffalo Clan, and they would share leadership of the tribe. Okay, 6 months of the year the Bear Clan would run the tribe, 6 months of the year the Buffalo Clan would run the tribe. It would be interesting for Democrats and Republicans to try that now and see how that works out. But it was very egalitarian. Now there were some downsides to that because it was very egalitarian. They probably engaged in maybe a little more warfare. Pretty much done. But the Oneota tribes, the Oneota people, were still in existence when white people showed up here. So I talked about that oral tradition, Ioway's oral tradition, and this is a map that was made by an Ioway leader named Nohart. He was probably about the last hereditary leader of the tribe. He died during the Civil War. But during a land disagreement in the 1830s with the Sacs and the Foxes, he created this map. And it showed basically probably from about 300 or 400 years of Ioway habitation. So each of these things that looks like a chocolate chip cookie is a village site, okay? And this long line here is the Mississippi River. This is going to be the Illinois River, and this is going to be the Missouri River. So we are right now we're about right in here. Here's Kansas City, so we're going to be right about there. So it's a real interesting example of how they saw the world, how they understood the world. Of course, you know, the rivers would have been their highways, so it's not really that different from a highway map we would have today. Between village sites are these little ant trails, and those show migration from one site to another. So you see, you know, they're way up here in the Great Lakes, they're up in southern Minnesota, western Iowa, they're all over the place, northern Missouri. And this is a kind of a map that goes along with it, and it shows, I went through read a lot of reports and a lot of sources, and every time there was a village site mentioned in a source, I'd plot it, and then I would put the year down. So you see they traveled around Iowa and northern Missouri quite a bit. By the time they were in, by the time Missouri became a state, the Ioways and the Saxon Foxes owned everything north of the Missouri River, or they had claim to it. They didn't really own it. And I think Mike's going to probably talk a little bit more about removal. So I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but in 1836, the Platte Purchase Treaty forced the Ioways and the Saxon, the Foxes out of Missouri. It was the first forced removal of a tribe from the state of Missouri. And then they ended up here at the Great Nemaha Agency, which is just across the river. And this is just kind of for reference. There are several tribes that are not listed here. There were several small reservations in here, but in about 1846, Missouri had really prided itself in pushing all of the indigenous people out of the state. And at this point, this was all Indian territory. This would be before the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Of course, there were thousands of Native people still in Missouri, but we pretended that there weren't. You know, we had pushed most of them out. And then way up here is the Ioway and the Sac Fox Reservation. This is the kind of thing I love to do. This is the way the reservation looked when they first moved there. The pink is the Sac and Fox Reservation, the yellow is the Ioways, and then right around here is the Mission Museum, where we will go tomorrow and where some of you would have been, I think, visited yesterday. And it's a really weird shape. To the south, there was already an established Kickapoo Reservation. And to the north, there was what was called a half-breed tract and an Odo people living to the north. So they had to squeeze this reservation in this spot. St. Joseph would be right over here. And the reason for the weird shape is that the United States government was really in a hurry to get the Ioways and the Saxon Foxes into Kansas, or into what was then Indian Territory. So they went in the spring of 1837, they wanted to get there early enough to plant their fields, and they congregated around the Wolf River. So they just all kind of congregated here, didn't really seem to pay much attention to the rest of the reservation. And then it was only once the village sites were established that a surveyor got around to getting out there to create the survey. And Isaac McCoy, who some of you probably know a lot about, he was a Baptist minister and a surveyor. So that's why the surveyor had to make equal amounts of land within this footprint. And so that's why it goes down the Wolf River. There were Sacs and Foxes living here, Ioways living here, so you get this weird jut down, and then it goes all the way up. So that accounts for the strange footprint of that. This is my redrawing of an 1847 or 1843 map. Actually, the original is on microfilm right up there. And I plotted it on a Google map, but I'll show you just the drawing of it. It's a little more clear. And this is of that part where the population was centered, where that survey line took a strange dip. But what you notice was, so the Missouri River is way at the top. Way up there is a town called Iowa Point, and that was a crossing between Missouri and the Indian Territory. And then all of these ant trails here are roads on the reservation. And this is some kind of version of the road to St. Joseph. I don't know that it's terribly accurate, except I know like Jackie's book does show it coming up from the southeast. And then this was the mission, this was the agency, and then the trail would have come through, sometimes visitors would have come through the mission. There's a place, or rather through the agency, there's a place right next to the mission building that's a swale, and for a long time it's been interpreted as actually being a part of the Oregon-California Trail. But in fact, what it is you can see this line, it's a feeder road that hooked up to, going up to Iowa Point and to other places. When people were traveling on the trail, this was about 2 days out of St. Joseph, and this was the last, what they consider, a lot of travelers considered this was the last civilization, last civilized place. Remember, this wasn't even really part of the organized United States yet. When they crossed the river here, they were entering Indian territory. So, in the late 1840s, as you know, those were boom years for the city of St. Joseph, when the combination of the California gold strike, I think I can use this again, the California gold strike and the people discovered that they could make a shortcut through St. Joseph. So suddenly, thousands of people were crossing here. In January 1848, there were like 25,000 wagons crossed the Missouri River from St. Joseph in a 10-week period. So it was a volume that this part of the country had never experienced before. And of course, St. Joseph's population bloomed, it just exploded. And another source I saw that 50,000 people may have passed through St. Joseph in the year 1847. I think Sarah Elder mentioned this the other day, but just in one caravan that passed through in May of 1844, there were, that's probably a typo, there were 323 people in 72 wagons. There were 713 head of cattle, 54 horses, 41 mules. And of course, that traffic not only did it affect the economy of St. Joseph, but it affected the reservation. It took a heavy toll. The St. Joseph Gazette reported in 1849 that the wagons on the Great Nemaha sub-agency stretched as far as the eye could see. And of course, this is not the sub-agency, but it's an illustration of a lot of wagons. And then I love the John Gass painting, the Progress of America, leading the wagon train across. So St. Joseph would have been really the first place that a lot of travelers on the Oregon Trail would have encountered indigenous people. This is the drawing on the bottom right is a Rudolf Kurz drawing. Kurz was either Swiss or German immigrant who traveled in these parts for quite a while in the late 1840s. And he noticed that he commented that on the streets of St. Joseph, one constantly sees Indians of various tribes, including the Potawatomis, the Foxes, Kickapoos, Ioways, and Odos. And he said they conduct themselves in a very dignified manner. He didn't have that stereotype of Native people being savages quite so much. And Sarah Elder quoted somebody here when they were waiting, they had to wait. It was Lodissa Frizzell in her journal. She talked about coming to St. Joseph and they had to wait for 2 hours to get a ferry across the road. And while they were waiting there, they counted over 200 Potawatomi and Winnebago Indians. So Native Americans were very prevalent here in town. This is where they had to come to, a lot of times to cross the river to get supplies. And so this was the first place, really, that a lot of white settlers and indigenous people sort of met for the first time. And of course, a lot of them brought with them preconceptions of Indians as savage people. They had never really had experiences, but they'd studied, heard about Indians, read paperback novels that existed even then about the savage Indians. And but at the same time, they were also really intrigued by their appearance. The first native people many settlers had ever seen, and several of them remember the ubiquitous red and green blankets that seemed to be wrapped around them at all times. A traveler named Sarah Sutton recalled that several natives came to see us. Their heads were shaved, all but a narrow strip from the crown of the head back that stood up, straight up. And their heads and temples were painted red. They wore heavy earrings and beads on their necks, rings on their wrists, and they looked like they were dressed up in their Sunday best to come visit the immigrants and to get all they could out of them. Another traveler said that they had a very bad time with the Indians. And of course, if you're living in a place, you've lived there for 10 years, and all of a sudden there's this big highway coming through, what are you going to do? You're going to see what kind of economic opportunities that highway lends to you. And then, of course, there's a quote here, many travelers found the mission to be a cheerful sight in this wild regions, and sometimes they would linger within the view of the houses, barns, and fences and fields before venturing to the uncertainty that awaited them farther west. This is the Wolf River, a famous painting. And the Wolf River was, after they crossed the Missouri River, the Wolf River was the first significant place river that the Ioways had to cross. And if you've seen it, it's kind of like, even today in places, it's like this painting because it has steep banks. So the Ioways set up a toll, and they forced travelers to pay a toll. And in the early days, if they paid that toll, then indigenous people would sort of help push their wagons through the water and up the bank. But then later in 1850, they constructed a wooden bridge that crossed the Wolf River. A settler named James Hawkins Clark complained that he'd had to pay $5 to cross the Missouri River here at St. Joseph. And then he just 2 days later, he had to pay the Ioways $1 to cross Wolf River. And the Ioways would not accept gold pieces. They only wanted the government-issued silver pieces with the bird on it, with the eagle on it. They insisted on that. And so a lot of settlers were really just incensed at having. One settler complained that he figured it only cost him $150 to build that bridge. Why should he pay $1? He and every other settler pay $1 to cross that bridge. So some of them did try to go around the bridge, but it was easier to pay the money and just go across. Somebody estimated that in the beginning of the season in 1850, by May 9th, 1,400 wagons had crossed that bridge. So it kind of makes you wonder how many of those little silver dollars with the bird on it did they get? Now the Saxon Foxes did not enjoy the benefits of the toll bridge, so they also tried to exact a toll from the settlers who crossed their part of the reservation. And they even carried with them signed certificates that they could show the settlers that the Indian agent had signed and said, this is legit, these guys, you can pay these guys money if they asked you. And the main issue was that, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, how big just one of those caravans could have been, and how many cattle, heads of cattle, how many people, how many wagons. Just think of the toll that takes on the land, plus the garbage that they would have left behind. And so suddenly the Ioways, Sacs, and Foxes were realizing their grass was disappearing because the cattle were eating it. Their wood was disappearing, their timber was disappearing because it was being used for fires. They were bringing sickness. And so this is why the Ioways and the Sacs and Foxes really decided that they needed to be compensated somehow. And settlers complained. They said, well, it's not our job to compensate the indigenous people for what we're doing. It's really the government's job. And so it became kind of a point of contention for a long time. And this is not on the reservation. This is farther west in Colorado. But the Ioways practiced internment in trees. And settlers, not only did they use the timber, eat the grass, all that, shoot the animals, but souvenir hunters would often take pieces of, take souvenirs from the bodies. So white people did not have, it was really popular at that time in the middle of the 19th century to keep bones of Native Americans, skulls of Native Americans as trophies and as souvenirs. Even George Catlin, who we think of as somebody who was who really liked Native people and was very sympathetic to them, took the skull of Blackbird, the Omaha chief, when he discovered that grave. So there's a couple of, in Jackie's book, I found a couple of quotes from settlers that one settler went by and he said, an old Indian warrior was wrapped in a rug, sitting high up in an oak tree, was a striking example of a particular kind of internment. And a couple of years later, another traveler saw a coffin containing the remains of an old Indian chief who died 4 years ago in a tree near Spider Creek. And despite the fact that he judged the coffin to be 30 feet off the ground, he could not resist climbing the tree and taking a bead from it. And there are reports that settlers even took people from the reservation. I've never seen anything that really is concrete evidence, but I've had elders from the Ioway tribe tell me that they grew up hearing this story. And in this Mary Alicia Owen ghost book story, ghost story book, there is a story in here called Poor Lucy. And poor Lucy was taken, as some travelers were crossing the Sac and Fox Reservation, they saw that some little kids out playing, and so they enticed the kids with biscuits or whatever they had to eat. And they thought, this would be kind of fun. We could take one of these kids to play with our kids, to keep them busy while we're on the trail. So in the story that Mary Alicia Owen collected, the folklore story, they took this child, which they named Lucy, with them to California. And of course, not only did Lucy have to play with the kids, but I'm sure she ended up taking care of the kids. And 2 years later, this family comes back. They had not prospered particularly well out in California, so they came back. And when they got to the spot where they had picked up Lucy, they dropped Lucy off and they continued on their way. And of course, in the meantime, Lucy's family had moved their village, and in the story that Mary Alicia Owen wrote, Lucy spends the rest of her life looking for her family, never to find them, and ends up, in one version of the story, she ends up in an insane asylum because she just, that cultural break could never be healed. And of course, sickness. The guy on the left is Hardheart. I mentioned him earlier. He's the guy who made the map, the last hereditary chief of the Ioways. And he was the one who really brought it to the government's attention that, look, this is taking, all this traffic is taking a real toll on our reservation. And something needs to be done about this. There were a lot of things in the press about here in St. Joseph about how many settlers were dying. But it's less known how many Ioways and Sacs Fox died. In 1851, the St. Joseph Gazette estimated that 30 to 40 deaths of immigrants and settlers had happened near the city in a single short period of time. That same month, the agent of the Ioway, or of the Great Nemaha Reservation, reported that smallpox had killed 1/7 of the Sac and Fox Nation, which could have been as many as 50 or 60 people based on the population. And at the same time, in December 1857, Reverend Samuel Irvin at the mission wrote that the Ioways had lost 5% of their population just in the last 4 months. And the Ioways, there were only about 400 of them at that time, so there was not really, didn't have a lot of people to lose. So while the stereotype is that settlers faced indigenous people who were angry, who were, not friendly, who would sometimes attack them, I guess what I'm trying to give you a hint of today is there were reasons for that. This was their homeland. This was a really heavy toll that it was exacting on their cultural sacred sites. There were crimes against their ancestors, crimes against their children, disease, deprivation, degradation of environment, and things like that. So that's why I think you hear a lot of those stories. And of course, this would have continued further west. And finally, if you want to learn more about the Ioways, of course, shameless plug there, I have 2 of my books here. The book on the far left is The Ioway Indians by Martha Royce Blaine. That first edition, I think, came out in 1979, but it was updated in about 1994, 1995. The book is not a very good read, but it is full of information, and it's really well footnoted. It's led me to government records all over the country, and then my 2 books too. So anyway, that is the end of my talk, and we do have a few minutes, I guess, for questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And thank you very much.